Hello, everybody. So we tried this once already and we lost our internet, so we had a problem. So this is The Witch in the Woods, take 2. Story coming to you from Europe is called The Witch in the Woods. Once, long ago, there was a poor orphan girl whose name was Goethe. And Goethe had found herself a good job working for a rich family. Now, her master and mistress found that Goethe was a very kind, very gentle, very good servant, and they loved her very much. She was a very good woman. And they loved her so much that when they would go off on journeys, on vacations, they took her with them. Instead of leaving her with the rest of the servants to watch the house, they would take Goethe with them. Well, Goethe and her master and mistress were off on a vacation one day, and they were having a wonderful time. In fact, they were having such a wonderful time that they forgot to pay attention to what was going on around them. And they were off in a lonely part of the mountains, and suddenly a band of robbers appeared, and they jumped out, and they cut the horses loose from the carriage, and they tipped the carriage over, and Goethe went flying out. And they killed Goethe's master and mistress before anybody could do anything. And Goethe, she quickly crawled behind a rock. And she hid behind the rock, and she watched everything that was happening. And as soon as she could possibly do it, she crawled off into the woods when the robbers weren't looking. And she ran off through the woods, and she ran, and she ran, and she ran, and she ran until she was so tired she simply couldn't run anymore. And she collapsed on the forest floor, and she started crying because, you see, she had loved her master and mistress very, very much. They were all she had in the world. They were her family. Well, after a while, Goethe was cried out, and so she stopped crying, and she looked around, and she realized that it was late in the afternoon, and she was not going to get out of the woods today. That just wasn't going to happen. And so she decided that she would probably need to sleep somewhere here, and maybe she would look for some berries or something. She didn't really know where to look, but maybe some berries. She could find something to eat, or she was really hungry. Well, as she was thinking these things, she suddenly spotted a beautiful white dove sitting in the tree. And as it flew down toward her, she put her hand out in surprise, and the dove landed on her hand. And it had this little tiny key in its beak. And it dropped that key into her hand, and then it said to her in a normal human voice, "If you'll take this key and go to that tree right over there, you will find that there is a keyhole in the tree. And if you unlock the tree, you'll find something to eat." So Goethe said, "Well, thank you very much." And the dove flew up into the tree, and she took the key, and she went over to the tree, and she opened it up, and it looked like a little pantry inside. And she found that there was a loaf of bread and a pitcher of cold milk in the tree. And she was so hungry that she ate the entire loaf of bread and drank all of that milk. Well, you know, sometimes when you're really hungry and you eat a really good meal, you get kind of sleepy. And Goethe had been running through the forest, and she had had such a long day of, first she was having fun with her master and mistress, and then they got killed, and then she was so scared, and then she ran through the forest for so long, and she was very, very tired. And so she started looking around, trying to find somewhere that she could sleep. And that dove, it flew down out of the tree again. It landed on her hand, and it dropped a key into her hand, and it said, "If you go to that tree right over there and unlock that tree, you will find someplace you can sleep." So Goethe said, "Well, thank you very much." And the dove flew back into the tree, and she took the key, and she went over to the tree, and she found, when she unlocked it, that there was a nice little bed inside of it. And so she laid down in that bed, and it was the most comfortable bed she had ever slept in. And she laid down on that bed, and very soon she was asleep, and she slept very well all night long. Well, the next morning when she woke up, she took the key for the pantry tree and she went back to the pantry tree. And when she unlocked it, there was more food in it for her. And so she ate the food. And she was looking about, trying to decide how would be the best way to go to maybe get out of the forest, when she saw that dove again. And it flew down out of the tree and it landed on her hand and it dropped a key into her hand and it said, if you will go to that tree right over there, you will find a dress that you can wear today. And Goethe said, well, thank you very much. She was rather like to change out of her old dress. It was torn and dirty from all of the running through the woods and everything. And so she took that key and she went over to the tree and she opened it up and it looked like a closet inside. There were all kinds of beautiful dresses in the closet. She looked at the dresses and she thought, if I wear one of those dresses, I'm going to look like a princess. But it would be very nice to wear a clean dress. All right. And so she reached in and she found a very pretty dress that was all in silver and blue. And she put it on, she pulled it on, and she looked very, very pretty indeed in that new dress. And the dove, it flew down from the tree and it landed on her hand and they talked together. And they talked for a while and then the dove flew away. And Goethe decided that she wasn't going to try to get out of the woods just today. She could use maybe a little more sleep. And so she stayed in that clearing, and she actually stayed for quite some time because, she had food, and she had a bed, and she had clothes, and she had a friend to talk to. The dove would come and talk to her all the time, but he never stayed for more than 2 hours, and she was a little sad about that. But she liked him very much, and in time she came to love him, and she decided that it wasn't that bad living in the forest. Well, one morning, when she got done eating and changed her dress, the dove came to her and he said to her, Goethe, would you do something for me? She said, well, yes, I would do anything for you, my friend, just ask. And he said, well, what I would like you to do, I will guide you through the forest to a little clearing where there's a house, a little cottage, and there's an old woman who lives there. And Goethe said, well, what would you like me to tell her? And he said, no. I do not want you to speak one word to her, not one. Just pass her by on her right-hand side and go into the house. And in that house, you will find a room. And that room will be completely filled with rings. Lots of rings, different colors, all very beautiful. And you will be very tempted to try those rings on. But you must not do that. What you must do is find the simplest and the plainest ring in that entire house. Put it on your finger and come back to me here in the clearing. And I promise I will be waiting for you. And Goethe said, go to the house. Do not speak to the woman. Pass her by on the right-hand side. Find the room full of rings. Find the plainest, simplest ring in that room. And then put it on my finger and come back here. I can do that. And he said to her, good. Do you promise that you will do this? And she said, I promise I'll do it. And he said, all right then. And so the dove began to fly off through the trees, and Goethe followed him. And followed him, and followed him. And he went so far, and he flew for so long that Goethe was starting to feel rather tired and wasn't sure how much longer she'd be able to go on. Well, just as she was beginning to think that, the dove flew up into a tree, and he stayed there instead of flying further. And he said, Goethe, the house is just beyond those trees there. Remember, you promised you would. And she said, go to the house, do not speak a word, pass her by on the right-hand side, go in, find the room full of rings, find the plainest, simplest ring, put it on my finger, and go back to the clearing. I promise. And he said, and I will be waiting for you. I promise. She said, all right. She took a deep breath. She was a little scared because an old woman living in the woods sounded rather like a witch, and she wasn't really sure she wanted to see a witch. But she had promised, and she could do this. She took a deep breath, and she did it. She walked into the clearing, and sure enough, standing in the clearing in front of a little cottage was an old woman dressed all in black, hunched over and leaning on a stick. And she looked up at Goethe with her little red eyes, and she said, "Hello, my dear. How wonderful to see you. Welcome to my little house. What can I do for you?" But Goethe didn't say one word to her. She just passed her by on the right-hand side, and she walked into the house, and she went through the house looking in all of the rooms until she found that room that was full of rings. And there were rings in that room. So many rings in that room, on every table, on every chair, on every countertop, on every dresser, all over the room, lots of rings, gold and silver and platinum and all kinds of jewels and rubies and diamonds and opals and pearls and emeralds and sapphires. Every kind of beautiful ring you could possibly think of was in that room. And Goethe looked at all of the beautiful rooms. It was so shiny in that room that it almost seemed to glow on its own with no other lights. And Goethe looked around the room, and she was very tempted to try on some of the very beautiful rings. But she remembered that she had promised to find the plainest, simplest ring, put it on her finger, and go back to the clearing. And so she started searching through the room. And she searched through every part of that room, and she couldn't find a single plain, simple ring. She thought, well, I must have missed it. There are a lot of rings in this room. And so she began searching again, and she searched through every part of that room, and she simply couldn't find a plain and simple ring. I must have missed it. It has to be here somewhere. The dove told me it would be here. So she started searching again. And just as she started searching again, the little old woman came to the door. She said, "Take whatever you like, my dear. I'm far too old for all these pretty baubles, but they would look lovely on you. You're such a pretty young thing. Is there something in particular you're looking for, my dear? Perhaps I can help you find it." But Goethe didn't say anything to her. She just continued to search through the rings. Well, the little old woman, she turned around and she left the room. And Goethe thought, I wonder if there could be somewhere else that ring might be hidden. And so she tiptoed very quietly to the door and she peeked out. And sure enough, that little old woman walked over to a little hook on the wall, and she took down a cage. And in that cage, there was a bird. And in the bird's beak was a very plain, very simple little gold ring. So Goethe sprang out of the room, and she snatched that cage from the old woman, and she pulled the ring out of the bird's beak, and she set the cage down. She slipped that ring on her finger, and she ran out of the cottage. And she ran, and she ran, and she ran all the way back to the clearing. When she got back to the clearing, she was kind of tired. And so she slumped down onto the ground, and she looked around the clearing, but nowhere did she see her friend the dove. And she thought, well, he promised he would be here. He promised. I did what I promised. I got the ring, I put it on my finger, came back to the clearing. That's all I had to do. He promised he would be here. And she was so tired and so sad because her friend had promised something and he hadn't done it that she started to cry. When she started to cry, she leaned against a tree that was right nearby. Well, when she leaned against that tree, as soon as she leaned against that tree, suddenly it changed, and it wasn't a tree anymore. It was a very handsome young man. And he put his arms around Goethe, and he opened his mouth, and he spoke to her. And when she heard his voice, it was the voice of her friend, the dove. And he said, "Goethe, my little Goethe, don't cry. I am your friend, the dove." That old woman was a witch, and she hated my father, the king, so much that she put a spell on me so that I had to be a dove part of the day and a tree part of the day. And the only way that spell could be broken is if a beautiful young girl would come and would get that ring and put it on her finger and take it out of the cottage. And now, Goethe, you have saved me. You've broken the spell. Will you come back with me to my father's house and be my wife? And Goethe said, well, I fell in love with my friend the dove, and you're the dove. So yes, I will come back with you to your father's house and I will marry you. And so the very next morning, when they got up, Goethe and the prince, they left the forest and they went back to his father's kingdom. And within a very few months, they were married and they lived very happily to the end of their days. And that is the story of The Witch in the Woods. I'm glad you tuned in, and we will see you again on Monday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time for another story from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. See you later. Have a good weekend. Bye.